Teachers, what's the scariest question a student's asked you? Mrs. McLean, why is there a worm in my body? Nomi was doubled over in pain and pressing on her abdomen. Her hands were shaking, and she described the feeling inside her as movement, like something crawling around in there. I sent another student to get the nurse while I stayed with Nomi, who was saying the movement was getting stronger. The nurse immediately called Nomi's parents with this horrified expression. The next day, Nomi wasn't in school. Her mother texted me that they'd spent 6 hours in the ER. The doctors had run blood tests and done an ultrasound but found nothing unusual. They prescribed anti-nausea medication and referred her to the gastroenterologist for further testing. Nomi returned to school 3 days later looking exhausted. She told me the sensations were getting worse and happening more frequently. She could barely concentrate in class and kept excusing herself to use the bathroom. During lunch, Nomi found me in my classroom crying. She lifted her shirt slightly to show me her stomach, and I saw her skin ripple. It was subtle but definitely there, like a wave moving across her abdomen. I felt my own stomach drop as I realized this wasn't just anxiety or imagination. I immediately called the nurse and Nomi's parents. We all agreed she needed to see a specialist right away. Her mother picked her up and drove straight to the children's hospital in the city. I spent the rest of the day distracted and worried about my student. That evening, Nomi's mom called with an update. The pediatric gastroenterologist had examined Nomi and ordered immediate imaging. The MRI showed what appeared to be a large mass in her intestines. They suspected a massive tapeworm infection and started her on anti-parasitic medication immediately. But things got worse. Nomi had a severe reaction to the medication and had to be admitted for observation. The movement became more violent and visible through her hospital gown. Nurses kept coming to look because they'd never seen anything like it. Infectious disease specialists were called in for consultation. I visited Nomi in the hospital that weekend. She looked thin and scared, hooked up to multiple IV lines. Her parents were exhausted. The doctors still weren't sure exactly what they were dealing with. The anti-parasitic drugs weren't working as expected, and surgery was being discussed. During my visit, I started feeling queasy. I attributed it to the hospital smell and emotional stress of seeing my student so sick. But as I drove home, the nausea got worse. I had to pull over twice to catch my breath. By the time I got home, I was sweating and cramping. The next morning, I woke up with severe abdominal pain. I tried to convince myself it was food poisoning or sympathy pains from worrying about Nomi. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The cramping came in waves just like Nomi had described. I made it through Monday classes by sheer willpower. Tuesday morning, I felt movement, distinct writhing in my lower abdomen. I sat in my empty classroom before first period trying not to panic. How was this possible? Tapeworms weren't contagious through casual contact. I thought back to the previous week. Nomi had been helping me organize lab supplies after school. We'd shared a bag of chips while working. By Wednesday, I couldn't hide my symptoms anymore. I called in sick and went to my doctor. I didn't mention Nomi or my suspicions about tapeworms because it sounded crazy. The doctor did basic tests and found nothing abnormal. He prescribed antacids and told me to rest. But I knew what I was feeling wasn't acid reflux. That afternoon, Nomi's mother called with disturbing news. The pathology results were confusing. What they'd found in Nomi's system had characteristics of a tapeworm, but also showed unusual cellular structures. The CDC had been contacted, and specialists were flying in. They wanted to interview everyone who'd had close contact with Nomi. I hung up the phone as another wave of movement rippled through my abdomen. Whatever was in Nomi was now in me too. I drove myself to the emergency room that night. When I explained my symptoms and connection to Nomi, the triage nurse's face changed. She immediately took me to an isolation room and called the infectious disease team. Within an hour, I was admitted to the same ward as Nomi. The doctors ran every test imaginable. Blood work, stool samples, imaging scans. They found the same unusual organisms in my system that they'd found in Nomi. But the DNA analysis made no sense. These things had tapeworm characteristics, but also cellular structures that shouldn't exist in any known parasite. As I lay in my hospital bed feeling the movement get stronger, a team from the CDC arrived. They weren't just infectious disease experts. Some were wearing badges from departments I'd never heard of. They asked strange questions about where Nomi and I had been, what we'd eaten, if we'd noticed any unusual environmental factors. One specialist pulled up a chair beside my bed. He looked tired and concerned as he explained what they'd discovered. The organisms weren't tapeworms or any known parasite. They showed signs of bioengineering with synthetic DNA sequences that didn't occur in nature. Someone or something had created these things. Mrs. McLean, he said quietly, we need to find out how you and Nomi were exposed. This isn't a natural infection. These organisms were designed, and we need to know why. What they said next flipped my entire world upside down. The specialist leaned closer to my bed and lowered his voice. These organisms were designed as biological weapons. My chest got tight as his words sank in. A defense contractor was testing delivery methods through food products. He pulled out a folder with documents stamped with red classification marks. Your school's vending machines were part of an unauthorized field test. His face looked grim as he explained they wanted to see if the organisms could survive commercial food processing. The contractor never expected actual deployment, just data collection. He rubbed his eyes and added that something went wrong with the containment protocols. I felt hot anger spreading through my body as I processed this information. Nomi and I were collateral damage in someone's weapons experiment. The movement in my abdomen got stronger, writhing harder against my insides. The organisms seemed to respond to my emotional state, twisting more violently as my rage built. The specialist stood up and introduced himself properly. I'm Malik Barnes from the CDC's Special Pathogens Unit. He pulled out a tablet and showed me a screen full of purchase records. We need to know everyone who ate from those specific vending machines in the past 2 weeks. The vendor had already given them the transaction data, but they needed confirmation. I told him about the chips Nomi and I shared while organizing lab supplies after school. She'd bought them from the machine by the science wing, the one with the faded Coca-Cola sticker. Malik made notes on his tablet and immediately radioed another agent through his earpiece. Quarantine the entire science hallway immediately. Through my hospital room window, I saw black SUVs pulling up to the emergency entrance. People in yellow hazmat suits started entering the building carrying large equipment cases. This wasn't just about 2 sick people anymore. This was a national security incident unfolding in real time around us. Hospital staff pressed against windows watching the federal agents take over their facility. A knock on my door made me turn away from the window. Nomi's mother stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn from exhaustion. Dark circles ringed her eyes and her clothes looked like she'd been wearing them for days. Did they tell you? Her voice cracked as she spoke. Did they tell you someone did this on purpose to test weapons on children? I nodded, unable to find words for the horror of it all. She walked into my room and sat in the chair beside my bed. We both started crying, 2 women bound by this nightmare neither of us asked for. Her daughter was down the hall suffering because someone wanted data on their weapon. Nurses kept checking on us with worried expressions they couldn't quite hide. The whole ward felt different now, transformed from a regular hospital into something else. We were in a contamination zone, a crime scene, a testing ground all at once. Yellow tape appeared across hallways and men in suits stationed themselves at every entrance. Later that afternoon, a woman in a white coat entered with a team of specialists I'd never seen before. I'm Dr. Deborah Sterling from the Infectious Disease Department. She set down a thick folder on the bedside table. We're developing a targeted treatment based on the organism's synthetic markers. Her team spread out charts showing molecular structures I didn't understand. Having 2 patients gives us better data for finding what works. She explained they could compare our responses and adjust the treatment accordingly. The treatment plan involved experimental drugs that weren't FDA approved yet. Dr. Sterling handed me a stack of consent forms and waivers thicker than my lesson plan binder. These medications were developed for military personnel exposed to biological agents. She pointed to different sections requiring signatures. We need your consent to use them off-label for this situation. My hands shook as I read through the pages of risks and side effects. Liver damage, kidney failure, neurological complications were all listed as possibilities. But I didn't have a choice with these things eating me from the inside. I signed my name on every line, initializing pages that basically said I understood I might die from the cure. The pen felt heavy in my hand as I wrote, knowing this was my only option. Dr. Sterling collected the forms, and her team started preparing IV bags filled with yellow liquid. We'll start with a low dose tonight and monitor your response. She checked my chart and made more notes. The organisms should start dying within 48 hours if the treatment works. Through all of this, I kept feeling the movement in my abdomen, constant reminders of what was growing inside me. Every few minutes, something would shift or writhe, making me grab my stomach involuntarily. The nurse hooked up the new IV line to my port, and I watched the yellow medicine drip slowly into my veins. Within minutes, I felt a burning sensation spreading through my body. The first battle in a war I never signed up for. Malik Barnes returned with more questions about the school, asking about the principal's involvement in vendor contracts. Something in his tone made me think they suspected more than just corporate negligence in this whole mess. As night fell, the movement inside me seemed to slow slightly, whether from the medicine or exhaustion I couldn't tell, but I knew this was just the beginning of a long fight to reclaim my body from these engineered invaders. That night, I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called Sharon on video, my sister who lived 3 states away and worked as a nurse at a cardiac unit. She answered on the second ring, and her face went pale when she saw me hooked up to all the IV lines and monitors beeping around me. I told her everything about the organisms and the weapons testing while she typed on her laptop, already booking flights and arranging coverage for her shifts at the hospital. She promised she'd be here in 2 days, and would make sure the doctors explained every single medication they were giving me, because she knew how hospitals could treat patients like lab rats when they had rare conditions. The burning from the yellow medicine spread through my chest and arms, making me sweat through my hospital gown within an hour of starting the infusion. Malik Barnes showed up the next morning with a thick folder of documents and started asking detailed questions about our school's food service contracts, wanting to know if Principal Parker Rubin had ever mentioned specific vendors or pushed certain products. I remembered Parker had been really insistent about keeping the same vending company, even when teachers complained about expired dates and weird tastes in the snacks. Malik wrote everything down and kept checking his phone, getting text updates from other agents who were investigating the school and the distribution company's warehouse. The experimental treatment hit me like a truck that afternoon, way worse than the organisms moving inside me had ever been. I threw up everything in my stomach, then kept dry heaving until my ribs hurt, and tears streamed down my face from the effort. The nurse gave me anti-nausea medicine through my IV, but it barely helped as waves of sickness rolled through me every few minutes. Dr. Sterling came in with an ultrasound machine and pressed the wand against my abdomen, showing me the screen where the dark masses of organisms had stopped their constant movement and seemed frozen in place. She said this was actually good news because it meant the medicine was working to paralyze them before killing them off. Down the hall, I could hear Nomi crying, and her mother speaking soft Spanish to comfort her, while nurses went in and out of her room constantly. Her dad walked past my door carrying a basin, and I saw how exhausted he looked. Dark circles under his eyes from not sleeping for days. Later that evening, a nurse told me Nomi was responding better to the treatment than I was, probably because kids' bodies could adapt faster. But she'd lost 15 pounds already, and could barely keep water down without throwing up. Her parents were taking 12-hour shifts, so someone was always there to hold her hand when the worst waves of sickness hit. 3 days into the treatment, which felt like 3 weeks, Malik came back with news that made everyone on the ward stop and stare. They'd arrested 2 executives from the defense contractor that morning, pulling them out of their offices in handcuffs while news cameras rolled. The FBI was now involved and treating this as domestic terrorism, even though the company kept claiming it was just research that went wrong. The company's assets were frozen immediately, and investigators were going through every document and email to find out who else knew about the weapons testing in civilian food supplies. Sharon finally arrived on day 4, bursting into my room with 2 bags and her tablet already out to review my chart. She went straight to the nurse's station and started asking questions about every single medication, demanding to see dosing protocols and checking for drug interactions the doctors might have missed. Having her there made me feel less alone and less like a science experiment because she knew exactly what questions to ask, and wouldn't let anyone brush her off with vague medical terms. She set up a whole system with color-coded notes about my medications, and made the nurses explain what each IV bag contained before they hooked it up. More news came in about other victims as the CDC tracked down everyone who'd eaten from vending machines serviced by the same company. 17 people across 3 states were now in hospitals with the same symptoms, though some cases were milder because they'd only eaten from the machines once or twice. The CDC was calling it a multi-state outbreak, and had teams investigating every location where the contaminated products had been distributed. Parker Rubin showed up at the hospital on day 7, looking like he'd aged 10 years in a week. He sat in the chair beside my bed and admitted he'd taken $50,000 in kickbacks from the vending company to keep their contract, despite complaints about food quality and safety. He swore over and over that he didn't know about the weapons testing, just thought he was taking money to overlook some expired products and keep the profitable contract going. I wanted to be angry at him, but I was too sick and exhausted to feel much of anything, except the constant nausea and the occasional twitch in my abdomen. By the end of the 2nd week, the violent movement had slowed to just occasional twitches that I could barely feel unless I pressed on my stomach. Dr. Sterling did another ultrasound and explained that the organisms had anchored themselves to my intestinal walls with tiny hooks, which meant they'd need careful extraction to avoid tearing holes in my intestines. The good news was they were definitely dying, but the bad news was it would take weeks to fully eliminate them from my system. That same day, I heard laughing from Nomi's room for the first time since we'd been admitted. Her mother came to tell me Nomi had managed to eat some chicken broth and keep it down, then sat up long enough to work on math homework her teacher had sent. Seeing even that small improvement in Nomi gave me hope that we'd both make it through this nightmare, even though the road ahead was still long and painful. 3 days later, Malik came back to my room with a laptop and a stack of papers, his face looking more serious than I'd ever seen it. He pulled up data on the screen showing protein sequences and transmission patterns that made my stomach turn, even without the organisms moving inside me anymore. The things in our bodies weren't just parasites. They were collecting information about us every second. Heart rate data, hormone levels, stress responses, body temperature, even brain chemistry changes were being recorded and transmitted through synthetic proteins that acted like biological Wi-Fi. The organisms had turned Nomi and me into walking surveillance devices, harvesting our most personal biological data, without our knowledge or consent. I pressed my hands against my stomach where I could still feel the occasional twitch, knowing that even my fear response right now was recorded and transmitted somewhere. Malik showed me timestamps correlating our stress spikes with data transmissions, proving these things responded to our emotional states, and sent that information to whoever was monitoring the experiment. My body had been turned into a lab rat's cage with invisible sensors tracking every biological function, every chemical change, every physical response to fear or pain or anger. The violation went deeper than just being poisoned because they'd stolen my body's most private information, turned my own nervous system into their data collection tool. Sharon arrived that afternoon with papers from a law firm that was filing a class action lawsuit against the defense contractor, the distribution company, and our school district on behalf of all 17 victims across 3 states. She helped me read through the documents and sign where needed, her nurse training making her understand the medical violations better than most lawyers would. The lawsuit sought damages for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and the unprecedented violation of using human beings as unwitting test subjects for biological weapons research. 2 weeks had passed since treatment started, and I could finally walk the hospital corridors, though I needed to stop and rest every 50 feet or so. Physical therapy sessions started that morning with exercises to rebuild core strength that the organisms had destroyed by anchoring to my intestinal walls and stealing nutrients. The therapist had me doing basic movements that should have been easy, but left me shaking and exhausted after just 10 minutes. My muscles had wasted away more than I'd realized, leaving me weak as a newborn trying to relearn how to move my own body. Trent Cabrera showed up during visiting hours carrying a box of get-well cards from students and looking uncomfortable in the sterile hospital environment. He sat down and started telling me about something he'd noticed weeks before anyone got sick: unusual metallic packaging in the garbage cans near the vending machines that didn't match any products he'd seen before. He'd reported it to maintenance and even mentioned it to Parker, but was told not to worry about it, that the vending company was probably just trying new packaging designs. The packages had a weird shimmer to them and felt heavier than normal chip bags or candy wrappers. Plus, they had no brand names or nutritional information printed on them. Malik practically ran to my room when I called him about Trent's information, bringing 2 other investigators who started recording everything Trent remembered about the packaging. This triggered a whole new investigation angle because it suggested someone at the school might have been monitoring the experiment, collecting the empty packages to hide evidence or track consumption rates. Malik's team started scheduling interviews with every staff member at the school, looking for anyone who might have been paid to observe and report on the experiment's progress. The next morning, Maya Richards was admitted to our ward with symptoms that had started 3 days earlier, though much milder than what Nomi and I experienced. She'd only eaten from the vending machines once during a late-night grading session, grabbing a bag of pretzels when she forgot to bring dinner. Her quick response to standard antiparasitic medication confirmed what the doctors suspected about exposure levels: that the amount of contaminated food consumed directly correlated with infection severity and treatment difficulty. The experimental drugs keeping me alive were starting to cause kidney problems, showing up in blood tests as elevated creatinine levels that had Dr. Sterling worried. She adjusted my dosing schedule and added intravenous fluids to help flush the toxins, explaining that we were basically testing the cure while fighting the disease at the same time. The medication was so new that side effects were being discovered in real time, making us guinea pigs twice over, first for the weapons and now for the treatment. My kidney function had to be monitored every 6 hours with blood draws that left my arms looking like a junkie's with all the needle marks. Nomi and I started doing video calls from our tablets since we were both too weak to visit each other's rooms anymore. She showed me drawings she'd been making during the boring hours between treatments, sketching what she imagined the organisms looked like based on how they felt moving inside her. The drawings were disturbing but beautiful in a weird way, turning our nightmare into art that helped her process the trauma of being used as a test subject. Her mother held the tablet for her during our calls because Nomi's hands shook too much from the medication side effects. During one of our video calls, Nomi was telling me about a dream where the organisms were talking to each other when Malik burst into my room with his phone pressed to his ear and his face pale. A whistleblower from inside the defense contractor had just contacted his team with documents that changed everything about our understanding of who authorized this horror. The test wasn't some rogue experiment by a greedy corporation, but had been approved by someone high up in the Department of Defense who wanted field data on biological weapon delivery systems. The documents showed payment authorizations, meeting notes, and email chains going all the way up to Pentagon officials who knew exactly what was tested in civilian populations. The news spread through the hospital like wildfire, and by morning there were reporters in the parking lot trying to get statements from anyone who'd talk about the biological weapons testing. Parents from our school started showing up with signs demanding answers, and within 2 days there were protests outside the district office with hundreds of people chanting for transparency. The local news picked it up first, but then CNN and Fox News sent crews, and suddenly our story was everywhere with headlines about government experiments on kids. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with texts from other teachers and friends who'd seen me on TV looking sick in my hospital bed during footage someone had leaked. Meanwhile, my body had stopped responding to the experimental drugs, and the organisms weren't dying anymore, but they weren't growing either. Which doctor? Sterling said meant we'd hit a plateau in treatment. She came to my room with a team of surgeons to discuss a more aggressive approach involving opening me up to physically remove the largest clusters of organisms from my intestines. The surgery would be risky because the organisms had attached themselves to my intestinal walls, but leaving them there meant they could start growing again once they adapted to the medication. I signed the consent forms with shaking hands, while Sharon held my other hand and promised she'd be there when I woke up. They scheduled my surgery for next week, which gave me 7 days to get mentally ready for having my stomach cut open and my guts handled by strangers. Sharon called our parents, who lived 3 states away, and arranged for them to fly in, even though I begged her not to, because I didn't want them seeing me this skinny and weak. But she was right that I needed them, and when they walked into my room 4 days before surgery, I started crying and couldn't stop for an hour. My mom held me while my dad paced around asking the nurses a million questions about the surgery success rates and recovery times. The day before my surgery, Nomi went in for hers, and I watched them wheel her past my room with her parents walking alongside the gurney holding her hands. Dr. Sterling had decided to do Nomi first, since she was younger and stronger, and her body might handle the trauma better. I spent 6 hours staring at the clock and checking my phone for updates from Nomi's mom, who was texting from the surgical waiting room. When they finally wheeled Nomi back, she was unconscious, but Dr. Sterling came to tell me it went great, and they'd removed about 80% of the organism clusters from her intestines and stomach. Seeing Nomi alive, even though she was hooked to more machines than before, gave me hope that maybe I'd survive my turn too. That night I couldn't sleep, so I used my phone to record voice messages for each of my classes, not knowing if I'd ever teach again. I told them to always ask questions and never just trust what adults in charge tell them, because sometimes those adults are lying or wrong or both. I saved the recordings to my cloud storage and emailed the links to the substitute teacher who'd been covering my classes for the past month. The next morning, they gave me something to relax me before wheeling me to the operating room, where the lights were so bright they hurt my eyes. I remember counting backwards from 10 and getting to 7 before everything went black, and then nothing for what felt like forever. I woke up 4 hours later with my whole middle on fire and tubes coming out of places I didn't know tubes could go. The surgery had taken longer than expected because the organisms had spread further than the scans showed. But Dr. Sterling said they got most of them out. The pain was worse than anything I'd ever felt, even with the morphine drip they had me on, and I kept pressing the button for more doses every 6 minutes when it would let me. Sharon stayed by my bed for the first 48 hours, making sure I did the breathing exercises to prevent pneumonia, and helping me sit up even though it felt like my stomach would rip open. 3 days post-surgery, I took my first steps with Sharon on one side and a physical therapist on the other, while my surgical site screamed with every movement. But each day got a tiny bit easier, and by day 5, I could shuffle to the bathroom by myself, even though it took 10 minutes to go 20 feet. Day 7. I managed to eat some chicken broth without throwing up, which Sharon celebrated like I'd won a marathon. Day 9, I could sit in a chair for an hour without crying from the pain, which meant the healing was progressing normally according to the surgeon. Malik showed up on day 11 with news that congressional hearings were being scheduled about the weapons testing program, and both Nomi and I would be asked to testify once we recovered enough to travel. He sat in my room for 2 hours going over what kinds of questions we might face and how to prepare our testimony to make the biggest impact on the investigation. 2 weeks after surgery, I could walk the whole hospital floor without stopping to rest, and my appetite was coming back slowly with crackers and soup staying down. Week 3 brought my first post-surgical scan, which showed only microscopic traces of organisms left in my system, too small for surgical removal, but manageable with continued medication. The combination of cutting out the big clusters and keeping up the drug treatment was working, and Dr. Sterling said I'd probably make a full recovery within 6 months. Nomi got discharged first on a Tuesday morning, and I watched from my doorway as her parents wheeled her past with balloons tied to the wheelchair. She waved at me with tears running down her face and mouthed, "Thank you," even though I didn't know what she was thanking me for since we'd both just been victims together. Her discharge meant she'd need weekly blood draws and checkups for the next year, but at least she could do them as an outpatient instead of living in this hospital room. My own discharge was still at least 2 weeks away according to Dr. Sterling, who wanted to make sure my surgical site was fully healed before sending me home. The news hit me while I was doing my morning walk around the hospital floor, when Malik showed up with papers showing the defense contractor had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. But the feds had already frozen $12 million in executive accounts and personal property, including houses and boats and cars. He sat next to me in the physical therapy room while I worked on basic core exercises that left me shaking and sweating after just 10 reps because the parasites had eaten away so much muscle tissue that my body had to rebuild from almost nothing. The physical therapist kept pushing me harder each session with planks that started at 5 seconds and worked up to 30, while my surgical scars pulled and burned with every movement, but I needed to get strong enough for discharge. 2 days later, the news broke that Parker Rubin had been arrested at his home at 6 in the morning with federal agents walking him out in handcuffs. While news cameras rolled and the charging documents showed emails where he'd agreed to keep the vending machines stocked in exchange for $50,000 deposited into an offshore account. The school board held an emergency meeting that Sharon watched on her laptop in my room, where they voted to establish a victim compensation fund using reserve funds and insurance settlements to cover medical costs beyond what our insurance paid, which wouldn't bring back the months we'd lost, but would help with the bills piling up at home. My discharge date got set for the following Tuesday after 8 weeks in the hospital, and 23 pounds lost from my already small frame, with Sharon arranging everything from a hospital bed rental for home to a visiting nurse who'd come 3 times a week to check my surgical sites and medication levels. The morning of discharge, I could barely get my regular clothes on because nothing fit right anymore, and my hands shook trying to button my shirt, but at least I was leaving without any organisms showing on the final scans, just microscopic debris that the medication would clear over time. Sharon drove me home, going slow over every bump while I held a pillow against my stomach to cushion the surgical sites. And when we pulled into my driveway, everything looked exactly the same as when I'd left 2 months ago, except I was completely different inside and out. The house felt too big and too quiet after the constant noise of the hospital with machines beeping and people talking, and I had to sit down every few minutes just walking from room to room because my stamina was gone. 3 days after getting home, Nomi and her parents showed up at my door with a pot of homemade chicken soup. And flowers, with Nomi looking thin but smiling as we compared our matching surgical scars and medication schedules and talked about which foods we could tolerate now and which ones made us sick. The FDA announcement came the next week about new testing requirements for all food distribution chains with mandatory contamination checks at multiple points. And they named it the Nomi McLean Protocol, which made me cry because at least something good would come from what we went through, even if it couldn't undo the damage to our bodies. My first therapy appointment was harder than I expected, with the therapist asking me to describe how it felt, knowing someone had deliberately infected me as part of an experiment. And I broke down sobbing about feeling violated and used and angry at everyone who'd let this happen. She specialized in medical trauma and gave me exercises to work through the nightmares and panic attacks that hit whenever I felt any normal stomach sensation, because my brain couldn't separate regular digestion from the memory of organisms moving inside me. The school district approved my gradual return, starting with teaching just one morning class 3 days a week. And when I walked into my classroom for the first time in 3 months, my students stood up and clapped, and some were crying, and they decorated the whole room with welcome back signs. They were so gentle with me that first day, with one student carrying my bag and another pulling out my chair, and they all knew not to bring any food from vending machines ever again because they'd followed every detail of the story in the news and online. During that first class, I had to sit down twice when I got dizzy, and my voice was weaker than before. But we made it through a simple lesson about chemical reactions while avoiding any discussion of biological systems or parasites or anything that might trigger the memories still so fresh in my mind. The principal replacement stopped by after class to check on me and explain all the new safety protocols they'd put in place, including removing all vending machines and requiring sealed lunch deliveries with chain of custody documentation, which seemed like overkill, but made parents feel better about sending their kids back. My visiting nurse came that afternoon to check my vitals and surgical sites and adjust my medications based on my blood work, showing my liver was stressed from processing all the anti-parasitic drugs for so long but slowly improving each week. Sharon stayed with me another 2 weeks, making sure I ate enough protein to rebuild muscle and helping me manage all the medical paperwork and insurance claims and victim fund applications that required endless documentation of every single expense and symptom and treatment. The Congressional hearing date arrived 3 weeks later, and I sat in my living room with Sharon setting up the laptop for my video testimony while my hands shook so bad I couldn't type the login code. The committee members appeared on screen looking serious as they asked me to describe the organisms moving inside me, and I told them about feeling them crawl through my intestines like living wire. I explained how the pain would come in waves that left me doubled over and unable to breathe, and how I'd lost 30 pounds because eating triggered the movement. They asked about the experimental treatment, and I described the drugs that made me throw up blood, and the surgery where they pulled clusters of synthetic organisms from my gut while I was cut open on the table. One congressman asked if I knew I was part of an experiment, and I said no and started crying because someone had used my body to test weapons without my permission. The hearing lasted 2 hours, and when it ended, I collapsed on the couch completely drained while Sharon brought me soup I could barely swallow. The next day, Nomi testified in person in Washington, and her mother sent me photos of her sitting at the witness table looking so small in her best dress with dark circles under her eyes. She told them about missing 4 months of 7th grade and how kids at the school were scared to sit near her because they thought she was contagious. She described the surgery scars across her stomach and how she still couldn't eat solid food without pain and might never be able to have children because of the damage. The news showed clips of Congress members wiping their eyes as she spoke about waking up screaming from nightmares where the organisms were eating her from inside. 2 days after the hearings, the Department of Defense announced they were reviewing every biological defense program in the country, and 3 officials resigned, including the deputy secretary, who'd approved the vending machine test. The media went crazy with the story, and protesters gathered outside defense contractor offices demanding justice, while survivors from other states started coming forward with their stories. 6 months after I first got sick, I was back teaching full-time, though I needed a special chair that let me recline when the fatigue hit, and had to leave twice a week for medical appointments. My classroom became the place where we talked about government ethics and corporate responsibility, and how to question authority when something seems wrong. Students would ask me about the organisms, and I'd tell them the truth about how power and money led people to treat us like lab rats. Nomi came back to the school that same month with a 504 plan that let her leave class whenever she needed and eat special meals in the nurse's office away from other students. She'd become this fierce advocate working with the district to create new food safety rules and inspect every delivery truck that came to campus. During lunch, she'd sit with me and we'd compare our medication schedules and talk about the documentary crew that wanted to film us. The criminal trial started 8 months after our infection, with both defense contractor executives facing terrorism charges that could mean life in prison. Malik called me every week with updates about the evidence they were presenting, including emails where the executives joked about their human test subjects. The prosecution showed photos of Nomi and me in the hospital with tubes down our throats and organisms visible under our skin, while the defense tried to claim it was just an accident. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury came back with guilty verdicts on all counts, and the judge sentenced both men to 25 years in federal prison. He called what they did an unconscionable exploitation of public trust that turned innocent people into unwilling experiments for profit and data collection. The courtroom erupted in cheers from other survivors and their families, while the executives were led away in handcuffs looking shocked that they'd actually face consequences. Our school got new vending machines from a company that had to pass background checks and provide documentation of every ingredient source, but most people brought lunch from home now. Trust in any institutional food was gone, and parents packed their kids' meals in clear containers, so they could see exactly what was inside. Teachers started eating together in the faculty room, comparing homemade lunches and sharing recipes for foods that were safe and simple. 9 months after everything started, a documentary crew reached out wanting to tell our story and show the world what biological weapons testing on civilians really looked like. Nomi and I talked it over and agreed because people needed to understand this wasn't science fiction, but something that happened to real kids and teachers in a regular American school. They filmed us in my classroom and at Nomi's house and in the hospital where we'd fought for our lives while someone collected data on our suffering. 1 year after the organisms first moved inside me, my health was stable enough to live mostly normal, though though I had to manage a careful diet of bland foods that wouldn't trigger my damaged digestive system. The synthetic organisms were gone according to every scan, but they'd changed how my body processed food, and I'd never eat a regular meal again without planning and preparation. Some days were better than others, but the fatigue would hit without warning, and I'd have to cancel plans or leave events early because my body just couldn't keep up anymore. Spring came, and with it the state science fair where Nomi stood beside her project board covered in charts about informed consent and biological weapons testing, while judges took notes and asked questions I couldn't hear from where I sat in the audience. She'd spent months researching every case of unethical human experimentation, and built a presentation that made grown adults uncomfortable with how clearly she explained what happened to us, and why it should never happen again. The judges kept coming back to her booth throughout the day, and other students gathered around listening to her explain how defense contractors had turned civilians into test subjects without their knowledge. When they announced the winners that evening, Nomi's name came first, and she walked to the stage carrying herself differently than the scared girl I'd visited in the hospital just months before. Her trophy was huge, but she held it steady while photographers from local papers took pictures, and her parents cried in their seats next to me. The next week, Sharon called to tell me the Victim Support Fund had finally been approved and would cover all our ongoing medical costs, plus therapy sessions for anyone affected by the contamination. She'd been working with lawyers to set up the system, and made sure families who couldn't afford treatment would get help navigating insurance claims and finding specialists who understood what we'd been through. I went back to my classroom that Monday and started organizing lab supplies with my new group of students who helped sort beakers and microscopes, while keeping their distance from the vending machines that had been replaced 3 times already. We worked in silence mostly, and nobody brought snacks to share anymore, but the simple act of doing normal teacher things felt like taking back control of my life, even though my hands still shook sometimes when I opened supply boxes. News came in June that Congress had passed the legislation requiring oversight of all defense contractor research, and they'd named it after Nomi, who got an official invitation to the signing ceremony in Washington. Her mother called me crying because her daughter would meet senators, and the president would sign a law with her name on it that would protect millions of people from what we went through. I flew to D.C. despite my doctor warning about travel stress, and sat in the gallery watching Nomi shake hands with politicians who treated her like the hero she'd become. She wore a navy suit that made her look older than 16, and when senators thanked her for her courage, she responded with the same steady voice she'd used at the science fair, explaining exactly why this law mattered. The signing itself took only minutes, but watching the president hand Nomi the pen while cameras flashed everywhere made me realize she'd transformed completely from victim to advocate in less than a year. Back home, our school held a memorial service in September, acknowledging what we'd lost even though we'd survived the organisms. The new principal who'd replaced Parker spoke about rebuilding trust through transparency and promised parents that every decision would be made with student safety as the only priority. Students read poems about innocence, and teachers shared memories of the time before when we could eat lunch together without fear, and parents didn't inspect every piece of food their kids brought to the school. Nomi and I started our weekly video calls that October, even though the official medical monitoring had ended, and we'd talk about everything from her college applications to my new lesson plans. She'd become like family to me, and we understood each other in ways nobody else could because we'd shared something so horrible it bonded us forever. She told me about her pre-med classes and how professors already knew her name from the news coverage, and I told her about teaching my new bioethics unit where students learned about informed consent using our case as the main example. 2 years after those first organisms moved inside us, I stood in front of my classroom teaching about the responsibility scientists have to protect human subjects, while Nomi sent me pictures from her biochemistry lab at university. She'd gotten into her top choice school with a full scholarship, and wrote essays about preventing biological weapons development, made admissions committees cry according to her acceptance letters. My digestive system would never work right again, and I still took 16 pills a day to manage the damage. But I could teach full-time and live mostly normal if I planned every meal carefully. Nomi had scarring too that showed up on her medical scans, but she ran marathons now to raise money for victims of unethical medical experiments, and wore her survivor status like armor. We didn't just make it through the weapons test that nearly killed us, but turned our suffering into something meaningful that would protect other teachers and students from ever facing what we did. Well, that's the grand finale, if you can even call it that. If you're still here, you might as well subscribe, because clearly you've already made some questionable choices.